So let's get started. Last time we talked about God's omnipresence. What does omni mean? All, or every, something that means a lot, or the totality of something. What does presence mean? Yeah, here. Close. Right? We might use the words close and far. When somebody is present, they are close. When they're absent, they are far. And so God is close. When we talk about his omnipresence, what is he close to? What is he close to? Everything, right? Omnipresence, all, to everything, close. So he's close to everything. What is he far away from? Sin. I would also argue everything. He is close to and far away from everything. How can he be close to and far away from everything? I think that's the ultimate answer, because he's God, right? But it's also because he doesn't deal in spatial. When somebody asks you the question, where does God dwell? That's kind of a ridiculous question. Where is a question that you can only answer when something has a finite body. Where is Brother Wint? We can answer that question. He's right there, right? Where is God? I can't answer that question because God isn't limited by space. In order for something to have a where, it has to be limited by space. And since God is outside of creation, he's spaceless, timeless, matterless, and all of those things that we've talked about. And if he is matterless and spaceless, then he doesn't have a where. You can't answer that question. It's a nonsense question when we start thinking about God. And so we talked a little bit about that last time, this omnipresence. And I wanted to read something that somebody wrote that helps me to understand it better. Because even when we talk about, in every answer that I've ever been able to come up with by myself, and that's the problem, by myself, they're always spatial. They're always like spatial answers. And God isn't a spatial being. He is spaceless. And so I wanted to read what this guy wrote. He has a series of books. If you're interested in reading them, get with me after, and I can tell you the name of the series of books. But this is what it says. We are suggesting that there is a divine dimension which it is impossible for us to conceptualize. In other words, it's hard for us to think about, which is not located in three-dimensional space, but which is adjacent to it at every point. See, in and adjacent are spatial words. We can't even talk about this without talking about space. And we are talking about a spaceless being. Right before this, he talked about the book Flatland. Have you ever read Flatland? Tabitha has. Anybody else? You should. It's a short book. It doesn't mean it's easy to read. Short books are typically dangerous, right? But it's a short book, and it talks about these beings that live in a two-dimensional universe. There is no third dimension. And a being that is three-dimensional comes and visits them and tries to show them what three dimensions look like. And so picture a sphere moving through 2D space, and basically what you have as a sphere moves through two-dimensional space is a circle that gets bigger and smaller. Right? So even when this sphere tries to show itself to the two-dimensional shapes, all the two-dimensional shapes see is a circle that gets bigger and smaller. So when Jesus, a divine, infinite, transcendent, spaceless, matterless, timeless, spiritual being, comes to earth to show us God, what do we see? That's a perfect way to describe it. We see the part that fits into the world. When Jesus comes, when the Spirit of Christ comes and dwells in that matter, that body that he dwelled in, that tent, that's what we saw. We saw a human that was like us. We didn't see the divine being, actually see it with our physical eyes, who is different than us. And so this is the conundrum that we're stuck with, and that's what he's trying to describe here. Thus, heaven, which remember just means up, heaven is not spatial or in space as such, but God is still not far from each one of us. In Acts chapter 17 and verse 24, the Apostle Paul makes two claims. That God doesn't dwell in temples. And that's true. Right? Solomon recognized that when he built the temple in Jerusalem. He says, the highest heavens cannot contain you, how much less this house that I have built. He's not contained by temples. And then Paul turns around and in verse 27 says that he is not far from each one of us. So the Apostle Paul, in talking to these Greeks, describes a God who is both far away and very close at the same time. I'm sure some of them went, huh? And that's why some people went and talked with Paul afterwards. He was talking about a God that they couldn't comprehend. In fact, there are actually, as we will suggest, 3 separate dimensions or realms, not to be confused with the fanciful 3-decker universe that you see some people ascribing to the Bible. The Bible doesn't think that God lives in the sky and the devil lives down under the earth. That's not what the Bible teaches. These that we live in are the material dimension, the world of space. Then the second would be the spiritual dimension, the realm of the created spirits, like angels. And the divine dimension, the third, which transcends both of the others as the exclusive and unapproachable realm of the infinite, uncreated God, who alone possesses immortality and dwells in unapproachable light, whom no man has seen or can see. And so in this way, you have this God who is separate and also right next to us at the same time. It's very difficult to comprehend. And this is the best explanation that I've ever heard with my limited ability to understand something like God. As that there's different spheres of existence. And there's this all-encompassing sphere, which is God. And everything else dwells within that sphere. And so in a sense, the way maybe you could say it is the physical universe dwells within the divine sphere of existence. And in that way, God is right next to us and far away from us at the same time. And it's important that we make this distinction too, that when you stick your finger out, you're not poking God. How come you're not poking God when you stick your finger out? It's not physical. Right. And in order to poke something, it has to be physical. You can't poke non-physical things with a physical finger. It doesn't work. Now, whether angels can poke each other, I don't know. That's a completely different question. But we cannot poke God. And so here's a quote from somebody entirely different who said something that I think is important to remember. To think of God's closeness only is pantheism. What is pantheism? What does pan mean? Yeah, it's everything, right? Different word means the same thing. Everything. What is theism? Yeah, God. We'll just say God for now. So pantheism is the idea that God is everything. When you sit on the bench, you're sitting on God. When you breathe the air, you are breathing in God. When you eat your steak or whatever you will have for lunch, you are eating God. That's pantheism. So if all we do is focus on God's closeness, that's what we wind up with. So to think only of God's closeness is pantheism. To think only of God's farness is deism. What's deism?
God created all the world.
Yeah. The picture of the watchmaker builds the watch, winds it up, lets it go. That's deism. It's kind of what Isaac Newton and Thomas Edison and some other people like that tended toward. This idea of a God who started stuff and then just let it go and didn't care about it or interact with it much after that. Are either one of those right? No, they're very, very wrong. And so we have this very delicate tightrope kind of that we have to walk, because if we focus on God being too close, we wind up eating him for lunch. If we focus on God being too far away, we wind up with not really any God at all. And so he says, this writer goes on to say, we have a God who is both close and far at the same time. Wow. Can you think of another God who has been conceived in the history of humanity who is like that? I can't. And I think the reason why we can't is because I can't really understand that, I don't think, let alone come up with it all by myself. And so it's a God that's beyond our imagination. And that's going to kind of keep that in mind, that this God is beyond our imagination as we get to the next thing, his omnipotence. Again, omni, all, potent, meaning what? Powerful, strong, mighty, whatever word you want to use to think of something that has force behind it. We can think of God's omnipotence, kind of, as a way, or as the ability to do whatever he pleases. What's the key in that statement? He pleases, right? That's the key. God is not powerful enough to do whatever I want him to. God is powerful enough to do whatever he wants to. And when we talk about God, remember we're talking about everything that is God, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. He is not bound by what people think he should do or demand of him, and whatever he wills to do, he is able to accomplish. So when we use this word, omnipotent, we have to be careful that we don't find ourselves making God do the absurd. He cannot make a rock. Right? So somebody comes to you and says, can God do anything? Well, it depends on what you mean by anything. But yes. Can God make a rock so big he cannot lift it? Is that even possible? People ask the question, and we do this because we like to sound smart. I think everybody likes to sound smart. And so we find things that we can ask or say that make us sound smart. And I've heard many people throughout my lifetime say, well, it's just what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. And literally what they have just done is made themselves silly. Literally. They have just spoken nonsense. If there is an immovable object, is there an unstoppable force? They can't both exist at the same time. If there is an immovable object, then by its very definition, this object is immovable. There is no such thing as an unstoppable force, because any force that runs into the immovable object is stopped, because this object is immovable. And if there is an unstoppable force, then there can be no such thing as an immovable object, because the unstoppable force will barrel over it and push it out of the way. It's moved. And so when we ask the question, can God, who is supposed to be all-powerful, make a rock so big that he cannot lift it, you've just asked a silly question. If there is an all-powerful God, then no, there would be nothing that he couldn't lift if he lived in this physical universe. Right? And so it's just silly all the way around. Kevin?
Well, I was going to say, you're probably right about a lot of people that they think of themselves so smart, but there's a whole lot of people out there that just want to make Christians look stupid.
Yes.
And that's part of the reason. Oh, I'll stump them with this brilliant question and they can't answer.
Yeah. And if you know people who are in high school and college age, that seems to be when this question surfaces the most. Like, I don't hear many adults sitting in coffee shops pondering immovable objects and unstoppable forces. And so if you know younger people, this is something that I would make sure that they hear, that there is no such, it's called a logical exclusion. Right? If you have an immovable object, no such thing as an unstoppable force. If you have a God who, for whatever reason, decided to manifest himself in the physical universe, no, there would not be a rock so big that he couldn't lift it, because he would be almighty. And so he could lift everything. And that's rational, it's logical, and anything else doesn't make sense. And so when we're talking about God's omnipotence, we have to understand that God is omnipotent in a sensible way. For example, God cannot orange an elephant into space and marmalade it. Yes?
I look to God as the air I breathe. Without it, there's no life. And that's the way I visualize God in my life.
Yeah, we can think of God that way as long as we don't actually think that the air is God. There's a difference there. Because otherwise we breathe him and we eat him. But I like that picture, that he is what sustains us. He is what keeps us alive on the time when we die. So we have a God who is sensible, he's rational, he's logical, and he can't do things that are ridiculous. This omnipotence, what is there in the creation, physical or spiritual, that he doesn't have power over? Nothing. Nothing, yeah. There was a riddle that the first time I heard it, I was in high school. I think I was a sophomore, maybe a junior in high school. And I didn't write it down, so I'm sure to forget it. But it was a riddle that over 90% of kindergartners got right, and less than 10% of college graduates got right. What is greater than God? More evil than the devil? Rich people don't have it, and poor people do. And if you eat it, you die. Nothing. That's the answer. Nothing. What's greater than God? Nothing. Right? And it's amazing how wise children are and how silly we become when we get educated. Right? So we have to make sure that in trying to learn, we don't become fools. And that when we start learning about God, we don't take things into the realm of the ridiculous. Because God is not ridiculous. He is rational, and he is sensible, and everything about him makes sense, logically and rationally. So this God is all powerful. Can you think of a way that Jesus showed his power over the creation, over the physical creation? What did he do? Yeah, the man is in a boat, and he's being racked by waves and wind. And he stands up and says, "Peace, be still." And it listened. It stopped. I remember one time I was a little kid, I went outside and it was raining, and I'd heard that story, and I yelled, "Peace, be still." And it stopped raining for a second, and I went, "Woohoo!" And then it rained again. So, yeah.
Well, I always think it's amazing that you have these very experienced fishermen. They're prepared to die. They're dying, and Jesus is in such control that he doesn't even have to stop it. He stops it for them. He's asleep in the boat.
Right.
He doesn't worry because he is in control. It's not going to be a problem. But it's like, okay, since y'all are such wins, I'll make it stop. But Jesus was in such control. There was no worry in him.
Right. That's a great point. Did everybody hear that? That Jesus was in such control, or he is in such control, that in that instance he didn't have to worry. It was for the people in the boat with him that he stopped the wind and the waves. Can you think of an instance where Jesus showed that he had power over the spiritual world? Yeah, he would drive demons out of the possessed. The demons would beg him for things. Why? Because he's in control, right? And he's not just kind of in control, but he's in complete control. And they can't do things without his allowing it. It's not like our state makes a law that says you can't drive 75 miles an hour or more than 75 miles an hour over this stretch of highway. Do people do it? Yeah, because our state is sovereign, but it's not really in control. If God were the state of Texas, it's a pretty close comparison. If God were the state of Texas and he said, "You will not drive over 75 miles an hour," and he enforced that, then would it be possible for you to drive over 75 miles an hour? No, it would be impossible. Now, sometimes God allows things, like he lets people make choices. He lets people sin. He could stop it if he wanted to, but he'd have to take away free will. And we've talked about that before, and we can talk about that again in the future. But we just have to understand that God is sovereign, and God is the one who keeps the universe working the way it does. Look over in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3. If you go to the back of the New Testament, the book of Revelation is big, and if you go to the left, the next really big book will be Hebrews. So in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3, it says, he is the radiance, talking about Jesus. He is the radiance of the glory of God, so we see God through Jesus. The exact imprint of his nature. So what would God be like if he took on human flesh? He'd be like Jesus, right? And he upholds the universe by what? By the word of his power. Same power that brought everything into existence is the same power that keeps everything in existence. And it is that same power that keeps everything working the way that it does now. And this is where the idea of deism kind of breaks, where God started the watch and now he just lets it run. It is verses like this, and there are other ones where it talks about God keeping the universe running by his power. When we think about it, there really is no such thing as natural law. It's a metaphor. When we say natural laws, that's a metaphor. Right? It's something that we as humans understand, that there is law. We have speed limit laws. We have laws relating to the sale and purchase of cabbages. We have laws. And we understand that these laws kind of govern normal, typical behavior. And when we talk about laws, what we are talking about with natural laws is the way that we typically see stuff act. But to think that there are really laws of nature is to, as C.S. Lewis said, to say that a stone falls to earth because it is obeying a law makes the stone a man and even a citizen. There's a difference between a rock falling because forces are acting on it and saying that there is some law of gravity. We get lost in that metaphor and we begin to actually think that there are laws governing the universe. When you come to the Bible, who is it that governs the universe? It's God. Why do rocks fall at 9.8 meters per second squared? On average. Because God wants them to. He didn't just design it that way. He keeps it working that way. What if God suddenly tomorrow decided that rocks should fall at 3.2 meters per second squared? What was that?
We would die.
We would die. Right? So thankfully, God keeps things pretty much the same. Because he has designed us to live in a very specific environment. And it is by his grace and mercy that God keeps that pretty specific environment in place. He could change it anytime he wants to. And so as scientists, when we go out into the world, and if you love knowledge, you're a scientist. Doesn't necessarily mean you have a lab coat or a degree, but you can love knowledge and be a scientist. When we go out into the universe, we are not discovering the laws of nature. We are discovering the work and the will of God. And we're seeing God at work. And that's one of the coolest things. People think that science is antithetical to God, that's opposed to God. Actually, science discovers God. It shows us God. It helps us to see and know him better by the creation that he has made. And so the Bible is very consistent all the way through, that God's power keeps all of these things happening, and that God's power is what allows us to exist and see the world around us, and it's God's power that is capable from saving us from sin. What is there that could save you from sin besides God? God alone is powerful to save. In 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4, who does God want to be saved? All people. Then how come all people aren't saved? Because he lets you choose. He allows you to choose. What if tomorrow God stopped making that choice optional? Who would become saved? What? Which is? Everybody. Right, that's one of the flaws in Calvinism. And ideas like it that say that God has total control over every human action. Well, God wants every human to be completely saved, to come to a knowledge of the truth, to be saved. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 4. So if God was in complete control, and you did not have the ability to choose, God made all the decisions, everybody would be saved. Everybody would be saved. And not only would everybody be saved, nobody would sin. It would kind of be like paradise on earth, except for the fact that you didn't get to choose anything, which would make you no more than a little automaton. You'd be saved, but you couldn't love God. Yes?
You use the argument that you started off the very beginning of your class with God being everywhere and nowhere at once, and everybody's saved, and everybody's saved. There's not even that concept of saved salvation.
Yeah, what are you saved from? Yeah. And so the idea, that's a very good point, the idea that there is even a salvation means that there's human choice involved. And so it's a sad situation, but God is sovereign over that, and it's God's power that is able to make us saved. In Jude 24 and 25, we don't reference Jude very much, but in Jude 24 and 25, whose power is it that is able to make us blameless? And whose power is it that is able to save us? God. Right? It's like, in the picture of David and Goliath, where you have these two champions who go out and fight, that actually used to happen. That's not something that the Bible thought would make a cool story. Armies used to do that. And the reason why armies would do that is because most of the Philistine army was farmers and fishermen, and most of the Hebrew army were farmers and shepherds. And what were they about to have to do in the summertime? They were going to have to go gather their harvest. They were going to have to go get their food. They were going to have to do all the things that farmers and fishers and shepherds do. And it is detrimental to your kingdom to kill all of your farmers. That is never a good idea. If you're going to take over a country and a government and start wiping people out, do the farmers last, right? Because you need to eat. And so kings in the ancient world understood that it's not a bright idea to go and get all of the farmers killed. And so sometimes they would get these huge armies just so that there was a show of force. Many times in the ancient world, half or more of the soldiers didn't even have weapons. You just needed bodies so that you could march somewhere and that the other king would take you seriously, and then they would meet and they would send out their trained fighters, and they would go and they would fight. Well, okay, you won this time. Better luck next year. And then they would go back. And so that's a real thing. And we're kind of like the army of the Israelites behind our David, Jesus. He goes and wins the victory. We win too. Not because we did anything, necessarily, other than what? To show up, to stay by him, to trust that when the little kid went out to fight Goliath, that he was going to win. We often talk, and I am so guilty of this, we often look negatively at the scriptures and we see all the bad things that people do because they're pretty easy to see. But when David goes out to fight the Philistine giant, notice how there's no account of all the Israelites packing up their stuff and getting ready to leave so that when Goliath clobbers the kid, I can get out of town. Nobody did that. Here's this little kid going out to fight the Philistine giant, and everybody stays. They trusted, or at least were curious, that what was David going to do? And so when we kind of think about us, we're not David going to fight Goliath. Oh, no. We're the Israelites standing on the side, watching Jesus go fight Goliath. And we win because he did. And you can see it's God's power that saves us. We win not because we were strong enough or smart enough or we did enough or any of those things. We win because we chose the right side. And we stood behind the victorious king, and we win because he did. That's 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 through 5. It talks about how we are protected and guarded by God. Well, how do you get protected by God? How do you have your salvation guarded by God until the last day? What do you have to do? You have to be on God's side. Right? And that's a general way to talk about it. What did you say, Seamus?
Yeah, you have to sign up and enroll and do the things you need to do and be on his side.
Yeah, you have to be on his side. And the Bible tells you how to do that. And so you follow the instructions on how to join the king's army. And then when the king goes out and is victorious, you win. Because you were there faithfully with the king while he won the battle. And so it's a very general way to talk about things, but it's important that we see and understand that our salvation comes not through our power, but through God's power. And the power that saves us is omnipotent. Things that are impossible with men are what with God? Possible. We're not strong enough. He is. Okay, let's kind of, really quick, we've got about 4 minutes left. Let's dive into the idea of omniscience or omniscience. When you look at the word, it looks like omniscience. So all knowledge. Remember, the word science just means knowledge. And so when we seek knowledge, we're learning science. We can think of God's omniscience as knowing all that is knowable. So he knows everything about himself. He knows everything about the spiritual realm. He knows everything about the physical realm. He knows everything that is knowable. This does not include nonsense. Right? How long do I feather a fish to drink a glass of mountains? Nobody knows the answer to that. That's not even a real question. It's nonsense. Right? How round is a square? That's a nonsensical question. It doesn't make sense. How many corners does a circle have? An infinite number. Right? It's nonsensical. Right? Those types of things, they're not really questions, especially when you get into the thing about the fish and the mountains and the glass full of it. It doesn't make sense. So God can know everything that is knowable. Can God keep a secret from himself? It is, isn't it? Because if you're keeping the secret from yourself, it's not a secret, you know it. Right? But that you're going to hear that. That is like one of the nuclear weapons that atheists will use. I've seen people use it in debates. Oh yeah, well if God knows everything, he's all powerful, can God keep a secret from himself? Really? Somebody told me one time that in situations like that, you should just laugh. Did you listen to what you just said? Then laugh and don't answer the question. It's more effective. So what you're seeing is that God isn't silly, and he knows everything. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 20, very simply stated, God knows everything. In Mark chapter 9 and verse 4, God knows our innermost thoughts and desires. Nothing is hidden from him. He knows not only what you do, but he knows why you do it. And it's the why part that's scary. I can handle the what most of the time. It's the why part that's scary. And that's when you get to Hebrews chapter 4, where it talks about the word of God dividing us up, dividing our thoughts and intentions. That's pretty scary that God's word does that. It's not just about actions. It's about why actions are done. It is possible, this God who knows everything, it is possible for God to put things out of his mind and not remember them. What does it mean when we talk about God putting things out of his mind? Again, that's kind of human talk. What's something that God doesn't remember? Yeah. So does it mean that he can't know them?
No, you're called.
Yeah, he doesn't recall them. He doesn't bring them up. When you get into an argument with God later, he's not going to list all the times you've sinned previously. Do people do that? You better believe it. We're really good at remembering people's sins. But God doesn't keep track of the sins for people whom he has forgiven. So when we talk about God's omniscience, there's some language kind of that shows that God forgets or doesn't remember or doesn't keep track of things. And that's not what we're talking about. Think more about this and look at Numbers 29 and verse 29. And we'll start talking about omniscience. We'll finish talking about omniscience next week. Thank you very much.